Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dominique, for inviting me back to the LSC Colloquium. This is my second Colloquium, so it's nice to be back on the home turf. So today I'm going to be talking about kind of a research agenda that I've been developing, integrating science communication research with concepts and frameworks from marketing and branding, which I think is a part of the science communication literature that is not fully developed. And so some of what I'm going to present to you today is some original data, but also just some of my thinking and thoughts. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what your thoughts and opinions are on how these frameworks play out. So how many of you know who Larry Page is? Several of you. So Larry Page is the co-founder of Google. And in 2007, Larry Page gave a keynote address to AAAS, right? One of the largest scientific societies in America, in the world, I should say. And the thesis of his talk was that science has a serious marketing problem. He went on, right, in his talk to say virtually all economic growth in the world was due to technological progress. And I think as a society, we're not really paying attention to that, right? Pretty bold statement, right? Science has a marketing problem. At this time, right, I'm sure many of you have read about leaders from the National Academies of Science and AAAS and other organizations of the scientific community pushing for scientists and scientific community to be better integrated with society, right? Scientists need to come and speak to the public, right? There needs to be better engagement. Public engagement is this term that was really used. But marketing is one of these concepts, right, that gets thrown around a lot, and I don't think we might not fully understand what really marketing is. So, what is the definition of marketing, right? So marketing is making a value proposition. That is what marketers do. Marketers try to understand from their consumer base what they value, right? And why they should care about their product, about their service, about their industry, about, right? We're in a political season right now. Everything politicians are doing are the same principles of marketing. They're marketing ideas, right, to their audience. So, some examples, right? Porsche. Nice little yellow Porsche Boxster, right? Why does someone buy a Porsche rather than a Honda, or rather than a Volvo, or rather than a Subaru, right? Because Porsche understands their value proposition, right? Unfulfilled dreams cost a lot more. Porsche is about fulfilling a dream, right? Wink. Whatever that dream might be. Moreover, right? I know that this text a lot of you can't read, but this is from copy from one of their ads. Of all the emotions you can expect while driving a Boxster, regret will never be one of them, right? It understands that the value, right, of a Porsche is that it's something, right, that is a lot of money you're spending and you're not going to regret this purchase, right? They understand their consumer base wants this as a product that will fulfill a dream for them. So let's take another example. Right here from Wisconsin, right? Harley Davidson, headquartered, I believe still in Milwaukee. It was started in Milwaukee, right? Harley Davidson, when you see a Harley Davidson ad, you don't see someone driving a Harley Davidson through the city. You don't see someone pulling up into their suburban house saying bye to their kids and driving away in their Harley Davidson, right? Harley Davidson's brand, or Harley Davidson's ad is someone like this driving on an open road, right? Someone exploring opportunities of the, right, limitless, right? Harley Davidson doesn't sell motorcycles, right? Harley Davidson sells an idea. Harley Davidson sells a lifestyle. They sell freedom. They sell attitude, right? Individualism. That's why Harley Davidson is the brand that it is today. They recognize, just as Porsche does, what their value proposition is to their consumer base. So, what makes marketing successful, therefore, I argue, is not necessarily, or what makes marketing successful is not necessarily the marketing problem, but it's the branding problem, right? So, not to go against Larry Page, but I would argue right? Science has a serious branding problem, more so than it does a marketing problem. But what is a brand, right? Again, one of these terms that you hear a lot of, but maybe you don't necessarily fully grasp the concepts that construct it. Brand is, and these are definitions from the American Marketing Association, right? They change over time. This is the most recent ones that I pulled the other day. A brand is an intangible asset that is intended to create distinctive images and associations in the minds of stakeholders, thereby generating benefit and value. This could be economic benefit and value. It could be social benefit and value, right? You can put your placeholder. Brand is the unspoken starting point for any object, person, or idea that a person first encounters. It is the emotional, sensory, and cognitive reflex we experience that shapes how subsequent information is gauged, right? We learned a lot about motivated reasoning and how we process information, right? Brand is essentially triggering those same parts of our brain, right? Brand is about reputation. If I was to say to you, cactus, right, a good example, probably right now, the constructs that are coming to your head are prickly or hot or Arizona, right? You have these constructs that are constituting what that means to you. The same thing happens with branding. Marketers want to know how to successfully create that brand in someone's mind. So branding doesn't just happen in a vacuum. We don't wake up one day and say Harley Davidson's lifestyle or Harley Davidson's brand is lifestyle, right? It's a strategic, integrated, right, communication campaign that's run over time, right? They understand their consumers, right? They do research about how this plays out. And so this was a model, right, from the brand book that Dominique mentioned in the opening about how, right, when we think about branding, it doesn't just happen, right, with the products or services that we buy. We think about it with people, right? Think about the politicians you're seeing on television right now. Think about yourselves as academics, right? We all personally brand ourselves. You think of organizations, you think of nations, right? You think of ideas, right? Something like science or any of the different constructs around science. But for each of these, right, communicators need to know who their customer base is, right? Why their customer base, right? What is that value proposition? Need to know how to communicate with their customer base, right? What channels, be it mediated or interpersonal, right? Many of you who know anything about marketing know the best, right, way of persuading a customer is through personal communication, right? We all trust, right, those who we're close to, right? So there's these different channels that brands operate. But what's different, I think, from some of the other kind of mediated frameworks that we think of is competition plays a big role in marketing and branding, right? All branding is about how you position, right? How you create a position of a product or a service or an idea to differentiate from others, right? So we saw that with Harley Davidson. We saw that with Porsche, right? So understanding your brand is very important to understanding how to successfully communicate that brand. But what happens if you don't know what your brand actually is, right? Or at least what that brand actually, how that brand actually resonates with your audience. New Coke. Does anybody remember New Coke, right? So for those who do, right, this was launched in the mid-'80s, right? This was a campaign by Coca-Cola, to put a new product on the market, right? Coca-Cola was facing competition from a bunch of diet colas coming out, 7-Up, Sprite, right, these non-cola beverages. But they also, right, they were finding that in taste test after taste test, consumers thought that the taste of Pepsi, right, the slightly sweeter carbonated beverage, was more tasty than Coke, their classic formula. So Coca-Cola decided that they'll revamp their product and put it out in the market, and sure enough, they did it, and there was huge backlash. Why was there backlash? Not because it was the taste of the product, right? It was because people did not appreciate Coca-Cola going in a new brand. Why is that? What is Coca-Cola's brand? Coca-Cola's brand is nostalgia. You grow up, right, having a Coke, your grandparents gave it to you. You go into any old diner, any old, right, restaurant across this country, maybe even others, you see the old Coca-Cola paraphernalia, right? But Coca-Cola also has a regional construct, right? It was founded in the South. It's It's a brand name for any carbonated beverage, right? Coca-Cola is beyond just some fizzy, sugary drink that we consume, right? It is an emotional, it is a cognitive construct, right? Now, when you have a can of Coke, right, it doesn't say new, it says classic, right? If you see Coca-Cola Classic, and then they were able to turn their brand positioning around, right? So knowing your brand is really important. So I want to break down now the anatomy of a brand before I start getting into connecting this to science specifically. So this is a framework going back to the 80s that really goes around brand concept management, right? But these are essentially the different touch points that we all have with products, services, ideas that which influence how we think of a brand, right? And you can think of these not necessarily as mutually exclusive, but for a moment I want you to, because often many of the products and services that we engage with, that we buy, fit into these different criterias, right? Lawnmowers. Many people don't buy lawnmowers because it gives them, right, this feeling of, social identity, right? They buy a lawnmower because it has a very functional purpose. It cuts lawn, right? Maybe it does so better than others, right? You think of a lot of products that are based around this idea of functionality. Symbolic, going back to the yellow Porsche, right? This is with a lot of cars, right? It's not just Porsche. A lot of luxury items, right, have that symbolic meaning, right? Symbolism reduces price sensitivity. It fills self-identity, right? It's a big part of why those products have the brand value that they do. Also is experiential, right? So there's a little snapshot I took of some dish, I don't know what it is, from Alinea, a really nice restaurant in Chicago. But right, you don't go to restaurants, right, because you're calculating the number of calories you need to consume each day, and right, that's functional belief. You go because you want an experience, you want a sensory overload, you want to have that, that engagement, right? So you can see that these, right, have different purposes, and for a brand, right, to be successful, they need to understand their positioning across all of these, right? When we think about, the Porsche example, or cars in general, right? Functionality can be a big part of a car, moreover than symbolic, right? If you're a family of 5, right, it probably doesn't make as much sense to buy a Porsche as it does maybe a minivan, right? Similarly, right, the symbolism, right, for some might be there, might be not. Experiences are very different, right? We all, as consumers, right, differ in how we experience the interplay of these three. So, building on this, I want to think about what is the value proposition for science, right? Science is this broad, complex institution that, right, we all think about a lot and we all do a lot of, right? So we think about it through this same framework of functional, symbolic, and experiential. So science is functional. Science cures diseases. Science puts those little microchips in our phones and in our computers, right, where they get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? That creates bridges. Science is integrated into everything we do. It is a functional component of life, right? Going back to Larry Page's first kind of sentiment about, right, no one's paying attention to, right, the process of all this technology. Science is experiential, right? We watch movies, Interstellar, right? We watch documentaries, PBS Nova, right? This is from the Museum of Science and Industry physics exhibit. Has anyone ever been to that before? It's pretty cool. You can touch and feel science, right? From Wisconsin Institutes of Discovery, right? Saturday Science, right? Informal and formal learning environments are a way for us to experience. I always thought these little plasma balls were cool, and touching them had this experiential component, so I put that up there. And then science is symbolic, right? We think of the space race back in the 1950s and 60s, right, and what this meant for, right, scientific optimism, what it meant for understanding, right, this new frontier, right? This was a major symbolism for what science is. But, right, in the same way that, right, buying a Porsche right, or purchasing any kind of luxury product is a way of self-identity, so too has science become a way of self-identity, right? March for Science is a perfect example, right? I would argue March for Science, whether it was intentional or not, was a branding campaign for science. It put a face on science, of what scientists look like, of what scientists care about. So, what I was interested in doing, along with collaborators of mine, Chris Volpe, who runs a nonprofit called Science Counts, as well as colleagues from the University of Texas, Anthony Dudo, graduate of LSC, and John Besley at Michigan State, and colleagues from the Alda Center, was to better understand how the public and scientists think and feel about science, right? So Chris, before we launched this survey and some of his original work, did focus groups around the country trying to figure out, when you say the word science, what are the positive and negative associations that come to mind? And through that came up with these 6 feelings, right? Fear, hope, joy, boredom, caution, or other, right? Which we used in our survey, and he used in a previous survey that I'm going to show some results of as well. So the 3 surveys I want to briefly show you about are, for those of you who saw the colloquium last year, I talked about the first 2, but an AAU survey. So this was a representative random sample of U.S. STEM faculty from AAU universities, which is 62 public and private universities in the United States, many of the R1 institutions. And we fielded this in fall of 2018, right? Our sample that I'm going to show you the results of is 516. For those of you that are curious about response rates, we sent out our sample to about 7,000 scientists. That's a little over 700 responded to that, and then we kind of did a 50% or more completion rate to get this 516. For the society survey, fielded around the same time, we did a sample of 27 different professional STEM societies. Again, in fall of 2018, we had about 5,000 responses, and then we dropped those who were not from the US, and again did not hit that 50% threshold, 316. And then the public that I'll talk about is a representative US sample from GFK, fielded in 2015. But I'll also talk about how these numbers haven't changed much in 2019. And the sample size was a little over 2,000. So what is the brand of science? How do scientists and scientists think about science? So I'm going to build this out. First of all, as you can imagine, other was a big category, right? Obviously, people didn't fit into these predefined categories. And for the purposes here, we only coded the other responses for the scientist surveys. We didn't do it for the public, but you'll see that probably wouldn't matter too much anyway as I go through this. So discovery and wonder, right? Small percentages as scientists, at least. Evidence, knowledge, truth, small percentages. Curiosity and interest, pretty small. Boredom and indifference, right? Maybe sometimes you in the lab feel that. We all feel that every now and then. Fear and caution, right? Again, really small. But what actually was the thoughts and feelings that stood out? It was joy and excitement and hope, right? These were the 2 main thought and feeling constructs that were identified, right? With scientists, you can see that it's more or less even, right? 43% joy and excitement, 37% hope. Society, 38%, 35%. But what's most striking, right, is this, right? This data from 2015. 63% of respondents across ideology, across levels of education, right, view science as hope. So, what does that mean? To put this, for those who don't like tables and like visual stuff, it looks like this, right? So the Y is the joy and excitement, right? And the X is hope, right? So I'll talk a little bit briefly about what this process-minded and payoff-minded is, but basically they were plotted, right? The AAU society and public. And what we see is that scientists are in over here, public is over here, right? Scientists have a lot to do when it comes to thinking about the brand of science to connect to how the public is thinking about that brand. So what do these differences that I allude to here, process-minded versus payoff-minded, mean? Right? The way we've thought about this is that, right, joy and excitement, right, what we call the process-minded, again, which most of the scientists were indicating, right, alludes to an emotional reward in the present. It's about the doing of science. It's about the joy, the frustration, but the actual, right, experiential process for many of these scientists of doing science. Versus hope, right, which is a very different emotion, right? Hope is an emotional reward in the future. It is a payoff orientation. It is about how something will, over time, give some benefit, right? I would argue, going back to our little model I'll talk more about, that's a pretty functional purpose. So hope, right? What does hope mean, right? Hope is this feeling of expectation and a desire for a certain thing to happen, right? But what are those hoping for and why? Why are we hoping for solving global warming? Are we hoping for curing cancer? Are we hoping for going to the moon? What does this hope construct mean? And I think, right, you come maybe next year, I'll have answers to this, but part of what I'm really interested in is deconstructing that hope. How does that hope manifest in science across the public, right? We know hope doesn't mean the same for everyone. Hope in and of itself is a very strong construct. It's a very powerful feeling. There's a lot of research on hope and hope messaging, especially within climate change. But within science more broadly, what does that mean? And I would argue that hope actually is really powerful for a brand for science. Why? Because science is a utility. Science does things for people, it does things for society. And that's why, right, we see that there are differences between when the context differs, so does the appreciation for that scientific research, right? And so this is data also from a more recent version of that public opinion survey from Science Counts. But right, we look at 3 issues: environment, national defense, health, and medicine. One would argue, right, liberals are much more, have much stronger feelings about the environment than conservatives. Conversely, liberals are much likely to have less strong feelings about national defense than conservatives. To do good environmental work and to do good research in national defense, they both require science. Science is the utility to get you to that end state. Yet we see these differences, right? Conservatives less likely to believe that it should be an urgent issue for scientific research, right? And these are just, by the way, I should have said this, but right, the different shapes are levels of education. I'm not really going to go into those details, but right, we see the flip side with national defense, right? Conservatives much more likely to view national defense research as important than liberals. When it comes to health and medicine, right, totally a application of science that affects us all, right? A lot of research and messaging around science says that, medicine and health and, right, several of the talks we heard last week and previously, there are a lot of controversial topics within this, right, that might have some of these divides, but on the face of it, we can agree that, right, scientific research in all of these would be pretty important. So, I give you an analogy, one that I talk with my colleague Chris about a lot, that I think is illustrative of this. We all disagree on music genres, right? I don't like country music. When I drive up north, right, and all the stations turn from, the kind of funky indie stuff on WORT, I get really frustrated when I can't find music that I like about country, right? I like jazz. Jazz is cool. Jazz puts me in a good mood, right? And I'm sure there's many of you that have this same opposite reaction than I do, right? You don't like jazz, but you like country, right? This is the point I'm trying to get at is, right, we both can disagree on music genres, but in the end, we both still enjoy music. Why is that? We don't go after the, right, producers of these, different types of genres. We don't talk about bias and, these different artists. It's because we appreciate, right? We all appreciate music, right? For those of you that actually play music, right? We all understand because we all grew up at least at some point trying to play a musical instrument, either succeeded in or not, right? It's difficult. It requires practice. It requires a lot of engagement, right? We have an appreciation for that engagement. So, and this is my ending soapbox. Science supporters and institutions need to make value propositions consistent with science's brand identity, right? For many of us, or for many that, right, at least when we think about how science's identity is communicated to us, much of it is through publicity, right? It might not be direct advertisements about science, right, that we see on when we're flipping through the channels, right? It's through things like the March for Science that gets publicity. It's through people like Greta Thunberg and others who are, right, ambassadors of different scientific issues that show up on our social media feeds or in the news. It's when policy and legislation comes on, like the Green New Deal, right? I would argue that all of these, right, are not necessarily functional or experiential. They're symbolic, right? And much of how science is being branded is through symbolism. So, moving forward, right, I think one of the things that, right, when we think about the different ways in which the scientific community, communicates, we think of coordination, we think of integration, right, the focus has been on the symbolism, which we know is a dividing factor, right, for a lot of different reasons, right? It's become, right, science has become, just like buying a Porsche is a form of self-identity, science is also a form of self-identity, right? It becomes another badge on your political, right, viewpoints. Right? The functional and the experiential are not as salient, right, to a lot of us as supporters and thinkers of science, right? So thinking more about how the functional aspects and the experiential aspects can be communicated, can be addressed, can be thought of, I think is an important step forward when we think about science communication, especially strategic science communication, right? As I mentioned, right, hope is how scientists and the public overwhelmingly, which is the most important thing, think about science, right? If any company was like, oh man, the brand of my product is hope, that's pretty awesome, right? So I don't think it's a lot about trying to continue on this path, but, right, connecting the dots for, right, how science is that utility, what is it trying to get at, and how can we as those who are interested in the intersection between science and society, use this as a way to think about, well, how can we be more strategic, right? Both as us as communicators in however way we communicate, but also when we think about the groups we belong to, when we think about the organizations we support, right? How their messaging comes across. So with that, I'll end it, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions.